you're so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
Ilhan Omar is probably the person who gets most abuse in US politics. If you don't know who she is a member of the so-called squad of left-wing progressive Democrats in a party that really isn't left-wing. If you think the Democratic Party is left-wing, you don't really know American politics enough. And she gets abuse from both sides of the spectrum. So she gets abuse from Republicans who dislike her for basically being Muslim, very visibly Muslim. She always wears a headscarf. She is an immigrant. She immigrated from Somalia when she was very young, so she still speaks with a slight hint of an accent. And well, she's hated by the Democratic establishment as well for her supposedly controversial views on key issues of U.S. foreign policy, particularly that relating to the Middle East. But of all the things she has said and done, probably none has received more near universal condemnation than a statement that she made a couple of days ago when discussing issues of accountability for crimes, war crimes, and crimes against humanity with Secretary of State Blinken. And here's the tweet that set off the storm. We must have the same level of accountability and justice for all victims of crimes against humanity. We have seen unthinkable atrocities committed by the US, Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban. So none of this is factually untrue. Yes, all victims should have some kind of accountability. It does not matter who killed you or who bombed your village or anything. You deserve justice. And yes, the US and Israel have committed war crimes. that is not in any way a dispute. But of course, she's being criticized for putting them all in the same sentence. So basically making an equivalence between what people see as two liberal democracies, namely the US and Israel, and the terrorist organizations like Hamas and the Taliban. So let's watch this video because there's been a lot of headlines, and I don't want to just go by the headlines. I think people need to see the primary source. So let's watch the video. And I'm going to use a different source because the link in her tweet, the sound is quite low. So let's listen.
The court's investigation in both Palestine and in Afghanistan. I haven't seen any evidence in either cases that domestic courts both can and will prosecute alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I would emphasize that in Israel and Palestine, this includes crimes committed by both the Israeli security forces and Hamas. In Afghanistan, it includes crimes committed by the Afghan national government and the Taliban. So in both of these cases, if domestic courts can't or won't pursue justice, and we oppose the ICC, where do we think the victims of these supposed crimes can go for justice?
So this is a very good question, and let me explain in layman terms what she means. Basically, as it stands now, if, say, the Israeli Defense Forces commit a war crime in Israel or Palestine, we have to trust the Israeli state, Israeli courts, to properly prosecute that war crime. And clearly there are very big incentives to not do that. Likewise, in Afghanistan, if the US or now that they're leaving the country, the Afghan national government, if they commit a war crime, again, we have to trust Afghan government courts to prosecute that crime. So in both cases, there's clearly an incentive not to do that. And in both cases, we can tell that if there are victims of crimes committed by Hamas or the Taliban, those will be prosecuted by those national authorities. But if the other opponents in this struggle commit war crimes, there's a good chance that they won't. So the existence of the ICC, which the US has always opposed, by the way, would, in a way, create a higher court that could potentially prosecute people in these states if their domestic courts were not willing to do so. So that is really what she's arguing. And I think that's a very, very, very good point.
And what justice mechanism for?
I'm sorry, Congressman, I lost you for 1 second there at the end of your question. Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah, I said in both of these cases, if domestic courts can't or won't pursue justice, and we oppose the ICC, where do we think victims are supposed to go for justice?
By the way, the one criticism that you can lay on Ilhan Omar is that she has a really bad internet connection and bad camera. I mean, even I have a better setup, and I don't have a U.S. representative salary.
And what justice mechanisms do you support for them?
Thank you. First, let me just say at the outset that it is impossible not to be profoundly moved by not just the loss of life in the recent violence and conflict, but especially the children whose lives were lost. And we all have a tendency to throw statistics and numbers out there, but we were talking about boys and girls, Israelis and Palestinians, as well as men and women.
So this is hilarious because if Ilhan Omar is being criticized for making an equivalency of how bad these different groups are, he's doing something even worse. He's basically like, yeah, let's not look at the numbers that show that Israel has killed far more Palestinian boys and girls than Israelis boys and girls have been killed by Hamas rockets. Let's just forget the numbers, okay? Let's make a false equivalence of like one child dead on the Israeli side is exactly the same as 100 dead on the Palestinian side. That's basically what he's doing. So he's allowed to do this, right? The pro-Israeli side is allowed to make these false equivalencies, but the pro-Palestinian side, no way. Even the slightest hint of making an equivalence is, oh my God, you're basically legitimizing terrorists. This is insane. This is insane.
And I think none of us, from whatever perspective we come, can lose sight of that. So that's one thing that's very important. Look, you know our views on the ICC and its jurisdiction. We continue to believe that absent a Security Council referral or absent the request by the state itself, that's not appropriate. I continue to believe that.
So the U.S., like I said, is strongly opposed to the ICC. And it's been so since it was initially created in, I think it was the late 90s or early 2000s. But there was a massive controversy, if you remember, back in the Bush era, over the potential ability of the ICC to prosecute American military personnel for war crimes in Afghanistan or Iraq, which was why Bush was so opposed to that. And obviously the US as a superpower just does not want any sort of international jurisdiction on anything it does. So it does believe itself to be above the law. And it is strange that a country that supposedly stands for this, global liberal international order, which is pure bullshit, I should say, strongly opposes an institution that would create a level playing field for prosecuting acts of human rights violations, war crimes, crimes against humanity, etc. So, and in this respect, Biden is no better than any of the previous Republican administrations. I mean, because no U.S. administration has supported the ICC. So this this idea that at least on foreign policy, Biden is really not that much different from Trump or Bush. Yeah, well, this is kind of a reflection of that.
Whether it is the United States or Israel, both of us have the means.
Mr. Secretary, I do understand that point. I'm asking what mechanisms do you think is available to them?
I believe that we have, whether it's the United States or Israel, we both have the mechanisms to make sure that there is accountability in any situations where there are concerns about the use of force and human rights, etc. I believe that both of our democracies have that capacity, and we've demonstrated it, and we'll need to continue to demonstrate it going forward.
So again, this is the idea that the U.S. and Israel have basically the God-given right to police themselves, despite the fact that they might not have an incentive to do so. And I would say this is especially the case with Israel. I mean, there is like no way that Israel will really want to appear as a war, any military commander from the IDF to be humiliated as a war criminal, because everything that Israel does against the Palestinians is based on this idea that Israel is like some benevolent liberal state fighting against terrorism, which is not the case. And to prove this, a friendly reminder of the actual Israeli military doctrine, which this goes back to one of the WikiLeaks cables. If you haven't heard of the Dahiya doctrine, I'm going to tell you what it is. And I'm going to read this one cable which describes it. Eisenhower labeled any Israel response to resume conflict the Dahiya doctrine in reference to the leveled Dahiya quarter in Beirut during the Second Lebanon War in 2006. He said Israel will use disproportionate force upon any village that fires upon Israel, quote, causing great damage and destruction. Eisenhower made very clear this is not a recommendation but an already approved plan. From the Israeli perspective, these are not civilian villages, they are military bases. Eisenhower in this statement echoed earlier private statements made by IDF Chief of General Staff Gabi Ashkenazi, who said the next fight in southern Lebanon will come at a much higher cost for both sides and that the IDF would not hold back. This is basically legitimizing war crimes, because by no standard of the imagination could you just take a civilian village, decide because you say so that it's a military base, and then bomb the crap out of it. In fact, this is specifically prohibited under the Geneva Convention, and I'm going to show you the section of the convention that deals with civilian targets. Article 52 of the protocols to the convention. General protection of civilian objects. 1. Civilian objects shall not be the object of attack or reprisal. Civilian objects are all objects which are not military objectives as defined by paragraph 2. Attacks shall be limited strictly to military objectives. Insofar as objects are concerned, military objectives are limited to those objects which by their nature, location, purpose, or use make an effective contribution to military action, and whose total, partial destruction, capture, or neutralization in the circumstances ruling at the time offers a definitive military advantage. So what's this mean? Basically, that means any actual like target belonging to an opposing military is legitimate, and also civilian infrastructure or civilian targets that directly aid the war effort would be. So, bombing a road which carries troops to the front, I think no one would disagree that that is not a valid objective. Bombing a power plant that also supplies, part of the military with electricity, that would also be a valid civilian target. No one is doubting that bit. But let's look at the third paragraph. In case of doubt whether an object which is normally dedicated to civilian purposes, such as a place of worship, a house or other dwelling, or a school, all of which, by the way, are routinely targeted by the Israeli military, is being used to make an effective contribution to military action, it shall be presumed not to be so used. So basically, the burden of proof is on the attacker to prove that these targets are actually being used by significant use, military use. So bombing the headquarters of the AP and Al Jazeera just because you claimed with no evidence that Hamas was hiding there, or bombing a school or a hospital because supposedly there's a Hamas tunnel underneath. I mean, all of these are all war crimes. Just all of them are war crimes, and you have to call them out that way. And the fact that she's not even doing that, like she's not specifically saying that all these things that Israel does are war crimes, or things that the US would have done in Afghanistan or earlier in Iraq, were war crimes. She simply mentioned that the US has committed these things and that Israel has as well, which is true, is factually true. Like, none of what she is saying in this tweet is factually inaccurate. It just bothers people in the Democratic establishment, the pro-Israeli side of the, which is pretty much almost the entire Democratic establishment. They're the ones who just cannot see anything, the US, Israel, and Hamas and the Taliban put in the same sentence, because then, according to them, that is a false equivalence. And you know what's the most pathetic thing about this? The most pathetic thing about this is that the Democratic leadership, which bands together to make statements like this, that says, like, the legitimate this is a statement by Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, as well as all her cronies there. Legitimate criticism of the policies of both the United States and Israel is protected by the values of free speech and democratic debate, and indeed such criticism is essential to the strength and health of our democracies. But drawing false equivalences between democracies like the US and Israel and groups that engage in terrorism like Hamas and the Taliban foments prejudice and undermines progress towards a future of peace and security for all. So first you're saying, oh, there is free speech, but not in this particular respect. Because free speech, I think, would also involve you making an equivalence, whether it's false or correct. Because Blinken just made one when he said, well, let's forget about the numbers. Let's forget that one side clearly kills way more people than the other side. Let's just say that people on both sides die. So how is that any different to what Ilhan Omar is saying? How is that, if she's saying, well, all sides commit war crimes, she's not implying that the war crimes that the US and Israel commit are perhaps worse than the ones that the Taliban or Hamas commit. Not at all. I mean, it could be the case that perhaps the US commits just one war crime and the Taliban commits 100. But that still doesn't mean that it didn't commit any. And that if we're concerned about giving accountability to the victims, then yeah, also the victims of US war crimes need to be considered. So this statement is just insane. We welcome the clarification by Congresswoman Omar that there is no moral equivalency between the US and Israel, Hamas, and the Taliban. No one is making a moral equivalency at all. Again, no one is saying that the US and Israel are just as bad as Hamas and the Taliban. At no point is she saying that. So this is merely a reaction to the fact that they're both being called out on things that they actually do. But that goes really against what the Democratic establishment wants to see in terms of the reaction of their of its party on this issue. And this is all part of just the general. The Democratic Party treats the members of the squad like, petulant children. That's really how they see them, despite the fact that some of them, like AOC, are some of the biggest. I think she is probably the #1 fundraiser for the party. And it's clear that if you look at the issues of, how the U.S. voter supports certain issues, it just happens to be that they are strongly supportive of progressive issues, not these, middle of the road establishment issues, the liberal centrist issues, that are really just like closet right-wing issues. But this is just so despicable in every way. And yeah, she gets so much abuse. You can agree or disagree with a lot of things that the squad stands for. I'm not here to defend their way, you know, what they stand for, or the way that they make politics. But come on, like, we really need to move on from this, just categorically. You can't make a statement saying that you have free speech, but then essentially cancel anyone who says something different than the official Democratic establishment party line. So I hope this explains why what she said is not really controversial, and why it's very, you know, beyond this issue with this particular video, or her the misinterpretation of her comments, why the point that she raises is a very valid one. You know, where is there going to be accountability when countries like the US and Israel commit war crimes, which they do? What institution, you know, what supranational institution is going to be there when these countries clearly have an incentive to not police their own the way that they should? Because if you look at all the cases where they've prosecuted someone like from the US, or a US ally like the UK, they've either gotten off quite lightly from what they committed, or in many cases this was only following a leak. So let's be honest, they don't want, it's in their interest to not appear like their foreign policy consists of committing war crimes in many cases. So, you know, this is the foreign the equivalent of like banks regulating themselves before the financial crisis. You just can't let anyone who has an incentive to just be let off the hook to do that. And that's the importance of why the ICC exists, and why the US, if it really cared for this liberal international order that it claims it cares for, and if Biden really wants to set himself as actually committed to human rights, and separate himself from the policies of his predecessor, then I think they should support an institution like the ICC. So, on that note, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, please share, please subscribe, and have a good day.